Auditors asked Parmalat to confirm a €4 billion bank account at Bank of America in the Cayman Islands. Bank of America replied, the account does not exist, had never existed. The investigators looked closer. €14 billion. Invented. This is Parmalat, Europe's biggest corporate fraud. When the auditors asked Parmalat to confirm the existence of a €4 billion bank account held at Bank of America in the Cayman Islands, the account that was supposed to represent the cash reserves of one of Europe's largest food companies, the Bank of America replied that the account did not exist and had never existed, and this was not a small discrepancy. This was €4 billion that the company had claimed to hold in cash that was simply not there. And as investigators began examining Parmalat's accounts, the full scale of what had been happening became clear. The company had been falsifying its accounts for nearly 2 decades, inventing assets that did not exist, hiding debts that did, and the total gap between what Parmalat claimed to be worth and what it actually was worth was approximately €14 billion, making it the largest corporate fraud in European history. Parmalat was founded in 1961 in Collecchio in the Emilia-Romagna region of northern Italy by Calisto Tanzi, a young Italian businessman who started with a small pasteurized milk business that he had inherited from his father. And over the following decades, Tanzi built Parmalat into one of the most recognized food brands in Europe and eventually in the world. The company became famous for its long-life milk in distinctive white cartons, and its dairy products were found in supermarkets across dozens of countries, and by the 1990s Parmalat was one of the largest food companies in the world with operations in 30 countries and revenues of billions of euros. But behind the successful consumer brand, a financial crisis had been developing for decades, and the problem began in the 1990s when Parmalat embarked on an aggressive international expansion, acquiring businesses in Brazil and Argentina and across Latin America and the United States. And many of these acquisitions performed poorly and the losses were significant, and rather than disclose the losses to investors, Tanzi and his finance director Fausto Tonna began hiding them, using a network of offshore subsidiaries and special-purpose vehicles to conceal the debts and invent fictitious assets that would make Parmalat's balance sheet appear healthy. The mechanism was not particularly sophisticated by the standards of later financial frauds. It was primarily a matter of falsifying documents, creating fictitious bank statements, inventing transactions between Parmalat subsidiaries that had never occurred, and submitting these false documents to auditors. But the scale over which this was done and the length of time over which it continued, nearly 20 years, and the complicity required across the company's finance function, all of this made it extraordinary. And the question that the collapse of Parmalat raised was not primarily about the sophistication of the fraud, it was about why it was not caught sooner, and the answer pointed to failures of auditing, failures of regulatory oversight, and failures of the banks that had helped Parmalat raise money from investors throughout the period when the fraud was occurring. Grant Thornton was Parmalat's primary auditor for most of the period of the fraud, and it was later found to have missed or ignored numerous warning signs, and Deloitte, which was also involved in auditing parts of the Parmalat structure, also faced questions about the adequacy of its work, and the auditing failures at Parmalat were part of a broader global conversation about auditor independence and effectiveness that had been triggered by Enron and WorldCom, and the response, which included new regulatory frameworks for auditors, was accelerated by the Parmalat collapse. The banks that helped Parmalat raise money from investors, including Citigroup and Deutsche Bank and UBS and several Italian banks, also faced scrutiny because they had been earning fees from underwriting Parmalat debt securities and had continued to do so even as questions about the company's financial position might have been apparent to sophisticated financial analysts examining the company's reported figures, and several banks ultimately paid settlements to Parmalat creditors and investors. In the years following the collapse, the end came in December 2003 when Parmalat missed a payment on a bond, and the investigation that followed quickly unraveled the entire structure. The Bank of America letter confirming the non-existence of the €4 billion account was the pivotal moment, and within weeks it was clear that the company's stated financial position bore almost no relationship to reality, and Parmalat filed for bankruptcy protection in Italy in December 2003, and the Italian government appointed Enrico Bondi as the extraordinary administrator to manage the restructuring. Calisto Tanzi was arrested in December 2003 and was subsequently convicted of market rigging and fraudulent bankruptcy and other charges, and was sentenced to 18 years in prison, a sentence later adjusted through various legal proceedings. And Fausto Tonna, the finance director, was also convicted and sentenced, and numerous other executives and external advisors faced criminal proceedings. The restructuring of Parmalat under Enrico Bondi was ultimately considered one of the more successful European corporate restructurings. The company emerged from bankruptcy and returned to the stock market in 2005 under new management, and Bondi aggressively pursued legal claims against the banks and advisors that had been associated with Parmalat during the fraud period, recovering billions in settlements and judgments. And the restructured Parmalat was eventually acquired by the French dairy giant Lactalis in 2011. So what is the real lesson of Parmalat? And the lesson is about the difference between a brand and a business. Parmalat had one of the most trusted and recognized consumer brands in Europe. The white Parmalat milk carton was a fixture in households across the continent. And this brand trust extended into the financial markets, where investors and analysts and auditors who should have been examining the numbers with cold analytical skepticism were instead influenced by the warmth and familiarity of the brand and by the personal relationships that Tanzi had built over decades with Italian banking and political circles. And the lesson is that brand recognition, however genuine, is not a substitute for financial transparency, and that the auditors and banks and regulators whose job it is to look behind the brand at the underlying numbers had in this case failed to do that job. That is the capital case. Subscribe to the capital case, because the next case is already waiting.